Well, welcome everyone to the conference, ASCE's 2021 first conference of the year. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our president and leader who will be opening our conference for us, Gary Maybarduk. It's a pleasure to have you here and to open the conference.
I prefer the title Comandante Jefe.
Yeah.
Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome to the second session of ASCE's 30th anniversary conference. Whether you're a new member or old or here for the first time, we're looking forward to sharing this adventure with you. ASCE was started 30 years ago by a group of Cuban American economists from the IMF, the development banks, and economic consultants. It was the highest powered group of researchers at the time studying the Cuban economy. Today, we are a much bigger organization, still with many economists, but also sociologists, political scientists, historians, and even some retired diplomats. We know of a good number of excellent economists from the island and growing numbers from the rest of the world. We are, I believe, still the largest group of academics and professionals continually studying the island. This year, the pandemic caused us to cancel our in-person conference last August and replace it with a virtual meeting. And since we cannot include as many speakers in a virtual meeting as we do an in-person meeting, we decided to hold a second meeting, which you are now attending. Although we were disappointed, we have found our switch has given us some great opportunities. First, we can now reach more people who have been unable to travel to the conferences. And it has allowed us to reach out to the island, very important, where it can be seen by those who can use Zoom and can see our recorded sessions on YouTube. With these opportunities in mind, we decided for this conference to encourage our speakers to speak to the island. Given we knew the announced reforms were likely to be incomplete, we wanted to make helpful suggestions as how they could be made to work. It is what economists would call proposing second or third best solutions. It is what I would call constructive criticism. I have not heard the presentations yet to see how close we came. You will have to be the judge. In the meantime, we have a number of very useful topics. Give me a second here. In our first panel this morning, well, I think it speaks for itself. We're going to talk about the economic situation and the strategy. Come on. The second session, external relations. We're going to be looking at how other countries relate to Cuba, what they can do to help, what they can't do. Tomorrow, we get a panel on U.S.-Cuba economic relations. That's going to look at where they stand, Helms-Burton, but also two of us will be speaking on U.S. foreign policy directly and how it can be used to try to increase the pace of reforms in Cuba, economic reforms in Cuba, if they're going to happen at all, and that's still a big question. Then that afternoon, we have, as usual in our present panels, we have one on agriculture. Agriculture being a really important part of the Cuban economy, especially as having a great deal of time feeding themselves. Wednesday afternoon is, I think, going to be one of the most interesting. Ever since the special period, the political situation in Cuba has changed somewhat. It's gone what I would go from what I was told, a really totalitarian system to something that's much more just simply authoritarian. Still nasty, but not quite as much. But there has been a weakening in what I call civic control. And the Constitution turned out to be a series of major debates. And I think showed really for the first time that there is some civil society beginning to develop. So I'm really looking forward to this session. It may give us a preview of things to come. Did I miss one? Anyway, the final one on Wednesday afternoon is Contemporary Crisis in Cuba and Venezuela. That has an historical anecdote. The August meeting was supposed to focus a lot on Cuba and Venezuela. That didn't happen. And so we've inserted it here. There may be some more panels coming up in the future on this, but there we go. Okay, and then finally, I want to give some thank yous. I'm trying to turn the share screen off. Come on.
We could see you, Gary. You're not sharing.
I'm not sharing? Thank you. Okay. So just a few thank yous. Once more, as he has for most of these 30 years, Jorge Perez Lopez was the key force in putting together these panels, with, of course, suggestions from the organizations, from the organization. Larry Catabaca, who really was one of the first to push us to move to a virtual setting, has organized the Zoom sessions, and Frank Martinez has provided the technical support that most of us have needed. But the entire board and many of us committee chairs also put in long hours, and I do mean long hours, in helping plan and publicizing this meeting. This was a community effort, and I am very grateful. I could not have done this on my own. The panel chairs were also responsible for herding each panel into a cohesive unit. And hopefully panel one's on is here. Okay, good. So I wish to thank all of you very much, and I hope you enjoy the conference. I'm out.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. We really appreciate that. And we are a little early for the start of the conference.
Well, I can do my opening again.
No. But I think that which is very unusual for conferences, but I think we're in an excellent position then to present the papers and then to generate perhaps a slightly longer period for questions and answers. So if our panelists are ready, and unless our attendees have any questions, perhaps we can proceed with our first panel. Carlos. Carlos. Oh. Let's see.
Okay. Organizers are very awesome.
Carlos, we're having some difficulty in hearing you.
Can you?
No, we're still having some difficulty.
Okay. Yeah, you hear me? Okay.
Well, we see a frozen image of you and every sixth word.
Let me. A lot.
No. No, we'll have to try this again. You may want to log out and log back in. For those of you who are students of semiotics, this might be an excellent moment to see if you can piece together meaning from every sixth word. We will examine you on your sense of what was just said at the end of the proceedings. But there we go. We will have our host back in a minute. And we do apologize for the technical difficulties. Although every time I use those words, I feel guilty about using administrative language. Mostly because one can't understand what that really means. And so I'll just continue to babble for a minute or two in a vain effort to entertain you while we wait for our host to come back. As we look forward to a great opening program made greater by the fact that after any number of years, the Cuban state and party apparatus has chosen to move fairly rapidly, at least in the announcement of all sorts of potentially transformative, at least rhetorically, measures. The scale, character, and implementation of which will probably keep us interested for a while. And I think our host is back. There's Carlos. Carlos.
Yes.
Much
Can you hear
better.
me now?
We can, and you're moving.
Okay, I don't know. I didn't pay this month's.
Well, I think you made a partial payment. Yeah, you have to pay the rest of the fee so that. No, I hate to say this, but it looks like you were caught in mid-Macarena. Carlos, it's not sort of working.
Thank everybody. The partial, yes. Thank everyone here, Larry, the organizer, Juan Carlos, and better service. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah,
all right.
I'm apologies.
While we're waiting, I neglected to mention some upcoming events for ASCE. In late January, Natalia Delgado is putting together a panel on the investment climate in Cuba, especially designed to talk about what legislation Cuba needs to pass internally to make it attractive to the foreign investors.
Apaga la luz. No te muevas por ahí porque esto sale en la pantalla.
Carlos?
Yes,
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to basically stop the video, and
Okay.
I'm just going to present it. I think this is the best way. Again, to make it, I want to thank everybody, all the organizers, Jorge Perez Lopez, Larry, Juan Carlos, everyone for their effort on putting together this panel and the whole conference. This particular session is entitled Cuba's Economic Situation and Strategy. I'm the chair, Carlos Seiglie, professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Economics. I'll mention the presenters just in case there's a glitch. Ernesto Hernandez-Cata will be presenting his paper entitled The Misery of Merchandise Exports and the Sustainability of the Cuban Balance of Payments. Everyone knows Ernesto, but I'll say a couple of quick words regarding him. Ernesto Hernandez-Cata holds a licencia from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and a PhD in economics from Yale. Most of his career was at the International Monetary Fund, where he served at various times as head of the North American Division, manager of the World Economic Outlook, chief negotiator with Russia, and associate director of the African and Western Hemisphere departments. He taught macroeconomics at the American University and economic development at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'll present the other speakers afterwards, but I'll mention who they are right now. Luis will be presenting a paper entitled Cuba, Dollar Crunch, Dollarization, and Devaluation. Jorge Sanguinetty will present a paper, Why is Cuba's Response to the Economic Crisis Insufficient? And Tamarys Bahamonde-Perez will be presenting a paper entitled Cuba's Bureaucratic System and the Economic Crisis. I want to make sure that everybody's aware that this is being recorded, including the mishaps that I just had on my end for technological purposes. So, Ernesto, if you want to proceed, and then after, what we'll do is at the end I will entertain questions. But at this point, once you're complete, then we will go with Luis presenting.
Okay, I'm Ernesto Hernandez-Cata. The paper is on the terrible behavior of Cuban exports in the long term and its impact on Cuba's balance of payments and how all this led to the crisis that the country is facing now. Let me first give you some stylized facts. Trying to get to the other slides.
Ernesto, I think it's up.
It's what?
I think that your slides are up. Can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I can't
Yes,
get,
I can see the slides.
okay, but I can't get to the second one.
I can.
There you go. Okay.
Just let me know when you want to. Let me know when you want to switch slides.
Okay.
Larry, could you put a full screen?
Yeah. There we go.
Okay. But I can't change slides.
I can.
Okay. So figure one gives you some stylized facts. If you go to the left of the figure, you see the collapse of exports after the end of relations with the Soviet Union, and then a slow trend towards slow growth in the rest of the figure. The bottom red line represents non-petroleum imports, and the top blue line represents total exports. I'm sorry. The top blue line represents total exports, and so the difference between the two lines is petroleum exports. So you see that after the end of the special period in 1994, you have some rather miserable growth. At the end of the period, exports are not only below what they were in 1991, but even below what they were in the rest of the period. Data for 2019, by the way, have just become available, supplied by ONI, the statistical agency, and they show further stagnation of exports. Oil exports, the difference between the two lines, have not made any lasting contribution to the total. There was a zoom in the early second decade of the period, but then a precipitous, equally precipitous decline. Let's go to the next chart. Here you see exports in percent of GDP, and I think there's no comment left. You also see the plunge early in the period, and then a decline, continuous decline in the rest of the period. Next slide. Okay, all this occurred in a period in which world trade was increasing very fast. Not only world trade, but also Latin American trade. And if you look at the right column of this table, what I have done here is calculate percentage changes at annual rates for a group of 7 Latin American countries of medium size. And you can see that with the exception of Jamaica, all these countries have had very rapid growth during the entire period from 1990 to 2018, 21% approximately, which contrasts with a decline of about 2% for Cuba. Next slide. Okay, let me just quickly go through imports, and here there's a sharp contrast with the behavior of exports. To the left, you can see that imports did decline sharply after the end of support from the Soviet Union, but then they rose very, very rapidly. Petroleum exports were high beginning in the early 2000s, largely because of the agreement with Venezuela. And then they increased very sharply through 2013, 2014, but then they plunged mostly because of the decline in oil prices, but also because Venezuela cut shipments to Cuba. Next slide. Okay, so we have weak exports and strong imports. And of course, this has led to a large deficit on merchandise trade. How is it possible then that the current account did not implode? Well, it did not implode because there was a surge in exports of services associated primarily with Venezuelan payments for the work of Cuban professionals, mostly doctors, but also security goons and educators. These payments have been partly in the form of petroleum for Algeria and Venezuela in particular, but also sometimes in the form of cash, investment, or loans. In addition to the help provided by services, there's been strong revenue from private remittances and tourism, and that also has helped to cushion the impact of the trade deficit on the current account. Let's look at the next slide. Here you see the graphic version of what I just said. At the bottom, you see the red line. You see the trade deficit on the large trade deficit. Above, you see the even larger services surplus, and the green histograms show first a few years of modest deficits and then reasonably strong surpluses thereafter. Next slide. Okay, here you see the same thing, but in numbers. If you look at 2012 and to the right, you see the surplus on goods and services, which is composed of a deficit on the trade balance and a larger surplus on the services balance. By the way, the surplus in goods and services seems to have diminished significantly with the preliminary figures we have for 2019. Now, in addition to the goods and services balances, we have current transfers, which have gone up and down, but recently have been relatively strong. Minimize this. There's something strange about the current transfers. Private remittances, mostly from the United States, have increased very strongly during the period from the beginning in around 2001. So how come the total for current transfers is not always positive? Because there is a mysterious element below transfers, always negative and becoming very substantial in recent years. Nobody knows exactly what these transfers are, but obviously they are imports, some imports of something from someone, but we don't know exactly why. Finally, you have investment income, which represents the largely the payment of Cuba for its external debt, and that is, of course, always negative. Next slide. Okay, so what do we have in the end? We have a decline in revenue from the work of Cuban professionals, particularly in Venezuela and Brazil, which has eliminated its program with Cuba. And this has been aggravated by the pandemic and the recession that came as a result, which has severely affected tourism, private remittances, and exports of goods. All this has hit the balance of payments, and particularly the very fragile current account, and it has sharply reduced the availability of foreign exchange. What has the government done? All this in the context of a very weak economy in general, and particularly of a decline in real GDP in 2009. The government has reacted by imposing administrative restrictions on imports, and that's not a very good idea because it increases the distortions already present in the economy, and it reduces domestic absorption and real GDP. But given the situation of foreign exchange, the government thought it had no option to react otherwise. Finally, the Cuban exchange rate system has been a cause of the unsustainable evolution of Cuban balance of payments and the scarcity of foreign exchange. The overhaul of the system has been promised for a long time, but now, mercifully, it is a fact. Cuba has devalued the peso at 24 coups per US dollar and has eliminated the ill-fated CUC, Cook. Rest in peace. Now it's the time to eliminate the widespread subsidies that have hindered the Cuban economy for decades. One very last remark, the bright idea of the Cuban government of launching a foreign policy based on politically oriented arrangement with unreliable friends and satellites. This has led to a disaster. And it's now time to eliminate these agreements and for Cuba to base its trade policy on comparative advantage. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ernesto. We're going to proceed then with our next speaker, and that is Luis, who's an international economist in Massachusetts, specializing in international finance. He has long been involved in international finance and investments as an officer of international organizations, commercial banks, and investment management companies. Luis is a member of ASCE since its foundation. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Notre Dame and has lectured at universities in the US, Europe, and South America. Luis, the floor is yours.
Unmute. Luis, unmute.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to Jorge Perez Lopez, Larry Katabaker, Frank Martinez, and the organizers of the conference for allowing me to participate. Let me now share my presentation. So my presentation is entitled Cuba Dollar Crunch, Dollarization, and Devaluation. And what I'm trying to do is make sense by use of a simple rational expectations model of the dynamics of what is going on in Cuba with the shortage of foreign exchange, the dollarization process, and the ongoing devaluation of the Cuban peso. Before I get there, I want to specify what are the questions and issues that I want to deal with. Why is there a dollar crunch in Cuba, which is reflected in widespread scarcity? What are the dynamics of dollarization? And I want to then talk a little bit about devaluation and exchange rate expectations, monetary bang and inflation, and then I end by talking about the big bang and the little bang. Now, just tying on to what Ernesto has said, I'd like to look at recent data of imports and exports. And I particularly like the import numbers because this is data up to the first 4 months of 2020. And there's been a collapse of imports. In other words, they dropped 51% between the first trimester of 2020 and the first trimester of 2018. And so why is this happening when there is a current account surplus, which Ernesto just showed us? In 2018, there was a 1 billion current account surplus. And presumably there is one in 2019. We haven't seen the numbers. Why is that? Well, the reason is that Cuba is not being paid for all the recorded exports of services that it provides to Venezuela in particular. Venezuela accounts for 90% of professional services, about 90%. And Venezuela pays some of it in oil, which Cuba gets, but Venezuela is unable to pay in cash. They are really going through a very severe crisis and they don't have the liquidity. So that these exports that are recorded and the services exports actually are huge. I think Ernesto showed the number. In 2018, the services balance was a surplus of 10.7 billion. But what happens is that Cuba doesn't receive the surplus in hard currency. As a matter of fact, Venezuela can pay in bolívares some of the surplus, or maybe, very likely, it's incurring some kind of unknown debt to Cuba, which, of course, we have not seen publicly. But the fact is that this blue line, the import line, is essentially the foreign currency constraint of Cuba, because these are essential imports, foodstuffs and medicine. They're over 50% of imports. They're absolutely necessary. And it's getting to the point at about 300 million per month where Cuba is close to the red line. In other words, so these are necessary, and less capability essentially will mean even worse shortages. So these are the facts. Now, what I want to look at is a little bit of the numbers. So imports declined 51%, as I said. The government just said last week that it has reported a 45% shortfall from budgeted foreign exchange earnings 2020. This was by Minister of Economics Hill. By year end 2020, imports are close to the red line, as I mentioned. Restrictions on tourism are due to continue into the first quarter of next year. And very importantly, the peso right now is trading at a range of 30 to 45 per dollar in the black market, signaling, of course, a shortage of foreign exchange. And the fact that the new foreign exchange of 24 pesos per dollar is not clearing the market. Now, in order to explain this, I use a simple model of 5 equations. I'm not going to show the equations. And essentially, I wrote the model that applies to the multiple currency economy, cooks, and dollars. The currency holdings depend on expectations about the exchange rate. People are rational, even though the government may set fixed exchange rates and fixed prices and so forth. Individuals and small firms and even state firms are essentially acting rationally in terms of what they expect the exchange rate to do. Dollar flow comes from net exports and remittances. I'm trying to help understand dollarization and the exchange rate movements. And importantly, the expected exchange rate is key in the perception of domestic prices. Now, I'm not going to show the equations, but I'm going to show a summary of what the model will do. So here we have a blue line, D. Essentially, that's the current account. It shows the flow of dollars. And means that at any points on the blue line are current account equilibrium. The red line is essentially a line which shows the points. These are dollar holdings in the population and the exchange rate, the points at which the expected exchange rate is 0. In other words, exchange rate stability or equilibrium in the exchange rate. Now, what happened in Cuba? Well, these are equilibrium exchange rates, by the way, which are not observed directly. But before the pandemic shock hit, which is, of course, the other reason why the dollar crunch is getting much worse after the first quarter of the year, holdings of the population in dollar terms were at a point like D1. But then the shock, the pandemic shock, shifts this blue line up, and then we go to an equilibrium exchange rate of around E2 and dollar holdings of D2. Now, the actual regulated exchange rate is around here somewhere. So these equilibrium rates are much higher, as the black market shows us. Now, the interesting thing about dollarization, which is these are dollar holdings by the population, is that because there are less dollars flowing into Cuba because of the pandemic, there are less dollars to be held by the population. So dollarization in Cuba involves holding fewer dollars. But the domestic value of these dollars, in this case, actually, it's an example, is higher. It's the product of E2 and D2, the area under the rectangle here. And in this case, I've done it as there is an increase in the peso value of dollar holdings. So dollarization appears to the public to be increasing, but actually, because there's a constraint on the flow of dollars, we have fewer dollars. So this sort of illustrates the situation using a model to order our thoughts. Now, what happened to the unification? Well, here we have these schedules essentially show us holdings of cooks and coops when the current account is in balance and when there are no expectations of a change in the exchange rate. So unification means that they're adding this is the cook curve and this is the coop curve. Unification means adding them up to the new coop curve, which is this black curve here. This is the one we are seeing presumably beginning this week. And so what happens? The official exchange rate was very low at a point like E0 here, well below the equilibrium rates. And then the government moves this official rate to E1, which I calculate is a factor of about 6 times. Why is that? Well, by looking at national accounts and expenditures in Cuba, I come up with a very rough estimate that the actual accounting transaction average rate in Cuba was 4 per dollar. So devaluation to 24 is a 6 times devaluation. So we move this E0 to E1, which is about 6 times. And then the government, because it's is all knowledge, knows everything, will then set up, these are pesos now, the new pesos, sets up an increase in the money supply of M1 to presumably be at this point. Of course, the government doesn't know precisely, but that's what they're trying to do. The problem is that this M1 will expand. Why will it expand? Well, number one, the devaluation of 6 times is huge and dislocates the economy, which means, among many things, that firms, whether state-owned or private firms, will have a huge problem in terms of their liquidity and able to meet their costs. So that this will require substantial financing from the central bank to Cuban banks beyond any mechanical calculation. Now, even more, the government will also have a huge fiscal deficit because subsidies, as we will see, are being reduced but not sufficiently. So essentially, it'll be pressured to move the money supply, to expand it. So essentially, it will be around here, which is way away from equilibrium. And this is what will lead to inflationary pressures. Now, what happened in the devaluation? Well, the currency unification and devaluation, as Ernesto mentioned, and many economists have said, was long overdue. The devaluation is it's about 6 times based on average CUP and CUP transactions, 4 per dollar. Now, the government, knowing everything, decides to match up the pass-through of the devaluation because essentially close to half of all Cuba's imports and a good chunk of household expenditures are dollar linked. So the pass-through effect is very high from the devaluation to prices. So the government, knowing everything, decides to increase minimum wages by 5.25%, electricity tariffs and many services by 5. They actually just reduced it a little bit. They just issued new rules this week or last week, decreasing a little bit, so the increase is below 5 times. But 5 times is huge, of course. I mean, big devaluations, in my experience, have always been something like 30% devaluation of the pound is a huge shock. Now, 6 times is a monumental shock. Now, government revenues are projected to increase 5.2 times, expenditures 4.9 times. So some reduction in net subsidies, but still there'll be huge subsidies, which will be financed by the central bank. There is no other financing. Cuba doesn't have debt markets, either domestic or access to foreign markets. So what about the monetary bank? Well, this is it. The fiscal deficit and the banking system will drive money expansion after the initial monetary bank. The government already estimates the budget deficit at 84 billion. Now, according to their numbers, this seems to amount to about 18% of GDP. I'm not sure about whether this will square, but it'll be a very large deficit, continuing deficit after the initial monetary bank, which will be financed by monetary expansion. So this budget deficit, and we already seen that exchange rate expectations are well over the official rates, provide a very difficult environment for inflation. And dollar scarcity means shortages of food and essential products, which will also pressure prices by having prices in the black market way above control prices. So the government is trying to control prices. It has a long list of prices that are controlled on services, and also has now said that it will impose top prices for the private sector. Now, what happens to the current account? Well, as I said, it's a mystery why a country with a current account surplus has so many problems with dollar shortage. Well, because essentially, is the flow. The dollar flow does not match the current account, Devaluations are usually done to improve the flow, the current account. But Cuba has inelastic exports and imports. Imports are necessities, they cannot be cut. And exports are also quite inelastic in merchandise exports. The country cannot expand nickel exports very rapidly, for instance. Tourism is more price sensitive, but now it's still being constrained by the pandemic. Import substitution is limited in the medium term. There's a lack of foreign finance. Cuba is undergoing this shock without foreign access to financial markets or support from international agencies or even bilateral lenders. The price system is in need of a rationing reform. There is a Minister of Prices. There's a Ministry of Prices, which actually, in my mind, is only a little bit less scary than the Interior Ministry, because what we are seeing is essentially the pretension that one can control hundreds of variables when there is being a shock of 6 times in terms of the devaluation impact, which means that relative prices are scrambled all over the economy, and then they are fixed, which essentially means the economy will be very difficult to react. Now, my thought on this is market reforms are inevitable. That's the history. And because you cannot really control the shock, consequences are essentially not being able to be managed by controls. But you know, as our friends Luis Locay and Jorge Perez Lopez say, these reforms in Cuba tend to be cyclical and tend to be unstable. In other words, they come and go. So if that's the way it's going to be, then they are not going to work very well either. Now, about the outlook, the dollar crunch will continue. When will tourism revive? Well, we can only guess. The pandemic eases and then tourism may revive by the second half of the year, but it's very difficult to pinpoint. The reluctance to reform is there, and the monetary bank unification will fast lose effectiveness. So that's why I talk about the big bang is a monetary bank, which certainly was a big impact, huge devaluation with rapid monetary expansion. But there's been the little bang. The little bang are the reforms. And without those, without essentially creating more flexibility for the private sector and for the state firms as well, the monetary bank will lose effectiveness without these sharp reforms. And this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Carlos, you want to introduce the next panelist?
Hi, yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Our next panelist is Jorge Sanguinetty, who earned the PhD in economics from the City University of New York. He worked in economic planning in Cuba in the 1960s. He's the author of Cuba, Realidad y Destino, Presente y Futuro de la Economía y la Realidad Cubanas, and many other papers and articles on the Cuban economy. He is the past president of the company DevTech, as well being a longtime member and one of the initial members of ASCE. All right, Jorge, the floor is yours.
You have to mute, Jorge.
Aló, ¿me oyen?
Sí, te escuchamos ahora.
Sí, pero no sé por qué no tengo video. Algo pasó aquí. Estoy teniendo problemas técnicos con el computador. De pronto. Bueno, voy a hacer la presentación de todas maneras. Voy a hacer la presentación en español porque quiero que la vean, que se oiga en Cuba cuanto antes. Wishful thinking, posiblemente. Ok, ahora volvió.
Jorge, we can see you on screen,
Ok, sí,
even if
ya.
you can't see yourself.
De pronto ya volvió, pero no sé por qué pasó esto. On mute. ¿Me están oyendo?
Can you hear me?
Sí, sí te escuchamos.
Ok,
Ok,
perfecto.
muchas gracias.
Bueno,
Tengo problemas. No sé qué problema hay aquí. Es que tengo los...
Tienes que dejar uno mudo y el otro, porque
Sí,
está.
sí, yo es que estoy...
Espera, deja ver cómo hago esto. Porque tengo que utilizar dos sistemas. ¿Me oyen?
Sí, ahora sí. Puedes
Sí.
comenzar, Jorge.
Que los loudspeakers del computador se fueron al diablo, no sé por qué. De pronto dejaron de funcionar y tuve que usar el video del computador y el audio del teléfono. Ahora estoy desconectado del teléfono, ok. Quiero empezar diciendo, como cuestión de background, el cambio revolucionario de la economía política cubana. Creo que es importante. Quiero hacer un vuelo de pájaros rápido de lo que ha pasado en Cuba y la racionalidad o irracionalidad de las decisiones económicas que se han tomado desde el comienzo del proceso en 1959. Lo que tenemos desde 1959 y en un par de años es un cambio traumático de la economía política cubana. ¿A qué me refiero con esto? De que de pronto en 2 años, solamente en 2 años, de millones de decision makers, de agentes decisorios en la economía cubana, empresarios, capitalistas, consumidores, trabajadores, de pronto de millones pasamos a unos cuantos, a una reducción drástica, traumática, verdaderamente de los que toman las decisiones en Cuba sobre la economía. De pronto tenemos que las decisiones de consumo las toma una oficina de planificación o unos burócratas, las decisiones de inversión la toma el gobierno de una manera muy centralizada, etcétera, etcétera. O sea, es muy importante tener en cuenta ese cambio radical de la economía política. O sea, no lo tenemos cuantificado, no lo tenemos en modelos matemáticos, pero existió y existe y todavía estamos pagando las consecuencias de que los decision makers, los agentes decisorios en Cuba, son nada más que unos cuantos. Y hay un divorcio completo entre los intereses de los que toman las decisiones y los intereses de los que sufren, los intereses de los que sufren las decisiones, o sea, básicamente los consumidores y los trabajadores. No quiero abundar sobre esto, va a estar en el paper en definitiva. Hay una caracterización cuando vemos la trayectoria de decisiones del gobierno desde el comienzo de la revolución, vemos una gran irracionalidad en la toma de decisiones, tanto que es muy difícil explicar por qué se tomaron tales y más cuáles decisiones. Entonces uno ve que la preponderancia de los factores políticos vence los factores económicos. Los factores económicos prácticamente son el resultado de decisiones que se toman, algunas increíblemente dañinas a la economía en términos generales. Pero la primera gran decisión es precisamente la que todavía estamos observando ahora con la devaluación parcial que se hizo del peso. Estamos viendo eso, uno de los grandes problemas con que empieza la economía cubana en 1959, cuando se establece el control de cambio en Cuba por el Banco Nacional y se mantiene la ficción de un peso igual a un dólar por 62 años. Y esto, el costo de la distorsión que esto significa en las empresas estatales en general y la desidia del gobierno en reconocer qué significaba esto, mantenimiento de una moneda sobrevaluada por tanto tiempo, es algo incomprensible por parte del gobierno. Después hay toda una serie de decisiones. Por ejemplo, en 1960, un dato que se subestima o se ignora muchas veces, es que se paró la producción de cuentas nacionales en Cuba. De pronto, el gobierno, a pesar de que estaba con una retórica de desarrollo a unas tasas anuales increíbles, ellos mismos se ciegan con respecto a cómo andaba la economía. No se sabe qué está pasando con la economía cubana, incluso por parte del propio gobierno. El propio gobierno se ciega a sí mismo en términos del funcionamiento de la economía, el performance de la economía. Entonces hay toda una serie, cuando examinamos, no quiero entrar en detalle, va a estar en el paper, cuando examinamos la trayectoria de decisiones del gobierno, sobre todo en el año 60, vemos una serie de medidas que son absolutamente irracionales. Quizás la más espectacular de todas, yo creo que es la que toma el mismo Fidel Castro en el año 68, cuando decide no simplemente privatizar, sino eliminar los pequeños negocios completamente que no son privatizables, o sea, los sillones de limpiabotas, los puestos ambulantes en las calles, etcétera, etcétera, desaparecen simplemente. No hay un proceso de privatización, pero hay un proceso de desaparición de un montón de servicios y de actividades productivas. Lo más importante que sucede en el año 68, sin embargo, es la eliminación de la contabilidad. O sea, aquí hay una historia que debiera ser una novela, que es lo que pasó con la eliminación de la contabilidad y cómo se pudo mantener el país 2 o 3 años. No se sabe, yo no lo he visto en realidad cómo se recupera la contabilidad en el país de alguna manera. Se establece se vuelve a una cierta racionalidad cuando, debido a presiones de la Unión Soviética, Cuba decide organizar un poco más su sistema de planificación y tomarlo en serio. Pero aquí hay toda una serie de decisiones que se toman que son extraordinarias y que indican la mentalidad del gobierno. En este caso hay un factor fundamental que es la superconcentración de todas las decisiones económicas en manos de Fidel Castro, quien, de acuerdo con los datos que existen, decide que la contabilidad no es necesaria porque como Cuba está construyendo una sociedad comunista y en la sociedad comunista el dinero no hace falta, por lo tanto no hace falta la contabilidad. Eso creó toda una serie de no simples distorsiones, creó realmente un verdadero caos administrativo en el país. Y ahí hay toda una serie de historias que no están escritas, no están reportadas, pero son sumamente importantes en cuanto a la mentalidad decisoria del sistema. Hay un regreso a una cierta normalidad, entre comillas, en los años 70 y 80, bajo la presión de la Unión Soviética, que querían un poco más de disciplina y de orden dentro de los términos soviéticos. Pero de pronto ya en los años 90 viene el colapso de la Unión Soviética, la desaparición de los subsidios de los cuales Cuba dependía desde el principio de la revolución. Y empiezan entonces la necesidad, se enfrentan a una realidad donde el gobierno está obligado a tomar decisiones un poco más racionales. La dolarización es una de ellas, que se ven forzados a aceptar el dólar porque simplemente con la desaparición de los subsidios soviéticos había que echarle mano a lo que pudiera. Si Cuba se abre entonces al turismo, al cual estuvo cerrado por mucho tiempo, se abre a la inversión extranjera que empezó en los propios años 80 y entonces hay un tema muy importante que es como resultado de la incapacidad del gobierno de mantener la ficción del pleno empleo, el pleno empleo socialista, donde no había desempleo en Cuba, supuestamente. Cuba tiene que, al ver que no puede pagar las nóminas de las empresas estatales y de los organismos del Estado, empieza a despedir gente y así se abre el cuentapropismo. Pero aquí es muy importante tener en cuenta que cuando se abre el cuentapropismo en Cuba, se abre de una manera provisional. No fue un reconocimiento del sector privado. A estas alturas del partido la palabra sector privado no se usa, está prohibida en los documentos oficiales. Pero eso empieza desde que cuando comienza el cuentapropismo. El gobierno da la nota clara de que iba a ser una medida provisional, que dejar trabajar por cuenta propia a los que estaban perdiendo sus empleos en el Estado, en las empresas estatales, en el gobierno, iba a ser una cosa temporal. O sea, la intención estaba claramente establecida de que no iba a haber un reconocimiento, una vuelta al sector privado o una forma de desarrollo capitalista, etc. Pero o sea, vemos la trayectoria de decisiones económicas que se empiezan a tomar, pero hay una renuencia sistemática a reformar el sistema. Y ahí es donde vemos cómo, o sea, hay un proceso de toma de decisiones erráticos donde es incomprensible la renuencia del gobierno a hacer reformas sustantivas de la economía. A pesar del consejo de muchos economistas cubanos que, tratando de salvar alguna forma de socialismo, le dan consejos al gobierno que el gobierno simplemente desconoce. No solamente los desconoce, sino que a veces cuando empiezan los procesos de proposición de reformas internas en los años 90, sobre todo llevadas a cabo por Pedro Monreal y Julio Carranza, la reacción inicial del gobierno fue muy negativa, tanto que le crearon problemas políticos, a pesar de que ellos se quedan en Cuba y tratan de contemporizar un poco la reacción ante cualquier reforma que fuera modesta era muy negativa. Uno entonces empieza a preguntarse cómo es posible que frente a la posibilidad de hacer reformas relativamente sencillas y relativamente baratas, donde no hacen falta grandes inversiones, simplemente el levantamiento de ciertas restricciones, sobre todo en el sector agropecuario, ya le generaría en Cuba una holgura suficiente como para garantizar un aumento de los abastecimientos. Aquí es donde yo creo que hay que buscar razones, cuáles son las razones por medio de las cuales el gobierno es tan renuente a hacer reformas. Entonces yo creo que ahí vale la pena entrar a considerar lo que se ha ido desarrollando en los últimos años, que es una especie de subdisciplina en economía, que es el estudio explícito de lo que llaman cultura, de cultura y economía, o la economía, del análisis económico de la cultura. Cultura no en el sentido vago de cultura, en el sentido estético o folclórico, etc. Los economistas que se han ido dedicando a los estudios culturales, a las causas culturales de ciertos fenómenos económicos, han sido muy específicos en definir que lo que estamos hablando, cuando hablamos de cultura y economía, estamos hablando de definición estrecha de cultura, muy específica, muy concreta, para evitar ambigüedades y conceptos vagos. Estamos hablando de cultura como, por ejemplo, Joel Nordvik habla de tres componentes fundamentales de cultura. Por un lado, creencia y conocimiento. Por otro lado, valores. Y por otro lado, preferencias. Claro, ahí tenemos que preguntarnos de quién. Aquí estamos entonces hablando tenemos que concentrar el estudio de estos elementos culturales en los que toman las decisiones, fundamentalmente en los que están en el gobierno cubano, el gobierno y el partido. podemos decir que hay un elemento cultural en esto. Aquí hay que preguntarse qué conocimientos tienen los que toman las decisiones y qué conocimientos o qué creencias mantienen los que toman las decisiones en Cuba para evitar la reforma. ¿Cómo están viendo la necesidad de garantizar niveles de producción mínimos para cubrir las necesidades del país? En este momento, precisamente ahora, hay reportes muy serios de escaseces que dan que pensar si Cuba se está aproximando a una crisis mayor de la que ha tenido hasta ahora, donde puede haber una cuestión de seguridad alimentaria o incluso una hambruna. Los reportes periodísticos que están llegando de distintos lugares del país indican que la escasez es seria. Y la escasez incluso de productos agrícolas que Cuba no debiera tener en cantidades suficientes como para alimentar a la población. Entonces, hay una cuestión, uno se pregunta, ¿por qué no toman decisiones básicas para liberar la producción de productos agropecuarios? Independientemente, obviamente el gobierno se da cuenta que tiene un problema. Cuando está afloja ahora, por ejemplo, las restricciones que le había puesto a la inversión extranjera en cuanto a participación de los capitalistas extranjeros en las inversiones nacionales. Inicialmente la ley se promulgó en términos de una participación mayoritaria del gobierno cubano como accionista. Ahora esa restricción, dado que la inversión extranjera el gobierno no ha conseguido atraer suficiente inversión extranjera, ahora han liberado esa restricción y le permiten al capitalista extranjero ser incluso dueño total de su inversión. Por supuesto, hay otros elementos que el capitalista extranjero va a tener en cuenta. O sea, hay claras indicaciones de que el gobierno cubano no entiende los principales agentes decisorios del gobierno y del partido. Geografía de la cual sabemos muy poco, quiénes toman las verdaderas decisiones, cómo se discuten ciertas alternativas, etcétera, etcétera. Pero obviamente están preocupados, pero siguen renuentes a hacer reformas. Yo he querido hablar de este tema porque es necesario cambiar la retórica que usamos para el gobierno. Ahora con los eventos del movimiento San Isidro y la posibilidad de diálogo, en Cuba los que tienen acceso a posibilidades de diálogo, tanto por parte de la disidencia como por parte del propio gobierno, tienen que usar una retórica más eficaz en términos de qué reformas hay que hacer. Hay que darse cuenta de que los individuos que están tomando las decisiones en Cuba no entienden, o sea, una cuestión tan pedestre como esta, hay que decirlo, no entienden la economía. Y es interesante tener en cuenta que los economistas cubanos de más gabarito, por decirlo en portugués, de más prestigio interno en Cuba, los que están en Cuba, los que están más o menos, quizás se puede decir que algunos están tratando de salvar el socialismo. Estos economistas son académicos. Generalmente los economistas más distinguidos de Cuba no están en el gobierno. El gobierno no tiene economistas que yo sepa. Yo no he visto economistas de cierto rango académico en la fila del gobierno tomando decisiones. O sea, los economistas que conocemos de Cuba, los que están en Cuba, los que viven en Cuba, son economistas académicos. Y esto siempre ha sido, desde el principio de la revolución, ha habido muy pocos economistas realmente bien formados, técnicamente bien formados, tomando las decisiones en el gobierno. O sea, las decisiones en el gobierno se han estado tomando a contrapelo del Consejo de Economistas Profesionales. Y esta tradición continúa. O O sea, hay definitivamente un problema de cultural en el sentido inicial que yo estaba planteando de creencias, conocimientos, preferencias, valores, donde hay un background, un trasfondo cognitivo, si se quiere, que impide las reformas. Entonces, en una situación como esta, tenemos que preguntarnos, bueno, ¿y por medio de qué retórica usamos para convencer a los economistas o los que toman las decisiones en el gobierno de que tienen que tomar ciertas decisiones fundamentales? O sea, Cuba ha estado completamente cerrada, incluso a reformas mínimas, a pesar de los consejos que han recibido en términos de los cambios que ha habido en China, en Vietnam, etcétera, etcétera. Cuba está en el atraso más profundo en términos del conocimiento económico, que es básico, es elemental. Y es increíble porque la situación que estamos enfrentando ahora, estamos llegando a una situación de posible crisis alimentaria. Lo que necesita son medidas relativamente baratas en cuanto a liberar restricciones en el campo y en el comercio y en la distribución. Ellos siguen empeñados en mantener el control sobre todo lo que se mueve en Cuba. Y entonces lo que hacen es poner a la economía en una camisa de fuerza. Entonces, ¿cuál es, de qué retórica, qué estrategia retórica podemos recomendar desde afuera, incluso a los propios colegas economistas que están allá o a la disidencia? Ahora con la posibilidad de diálogo, una posibilidad teórica todavía, por supuesto, que se abre con el movimiento San Isidro, hay una desorientación enorme en cuanto a los individuos que quieren entrar en un tipo de diálogo con el gobierno, pero tienen que dialogar con el gobierno en términos que no conocemos. No sabemos qué estrategia retórica serviría para convencer a alguien en el gobierno de que tiene que tomar en serio varias reformas. Esto me entra a colación una máxima o una anotación de Max Planck, el físico, que decía que cuando los que se oponen a grandes cambios, se refería mucho a cambios científicos, pero es aplicable a muchas situaciones. No vale la pena perder el tiempo tratando de convencer a esos que se oponen. O sea, cuando se oponen esos opositores, tendrán que morir antes que haya cambios. O sea, hay que empezar a trabajar en los cambios en las mentes de otras personas. Entonces, efectivamente, en Cuba tenemos un desafío muy grande, que es cómo podemos vender los cambios que hay que realizar en Cuba para poder salir de esta situación o aliviar por lo menos esta situación. Aquí creo que es importante tener en cuenta que hay un proceso evolutivo en marcha en Cuba. Los agentes decisionarios más importantes se están muriendo. Están llegando a una edad en que tienen que ser reemplazados por otros individuos. Los cambios en Cuba van a depender de quienes vengan detrás de eso. Los cambios, posiblemente los más fáciles de realizar, vendrán en las cabezas de otros individuos que no conocemos, no sabemos quiénes son. No sabemos si están ya hoy en el gobierno o en el partido, o si van a tener que salir de eso. Entonces, el desafío que nos enfrentamos es reconocer los elementos culturales, de nuevo, en el sentido que expliqué al principio, en términos de conocimientos, creencias, valores, preferencias, que los tengo más detallados en el trabajo que estoy haciendo todavía. Pero es importante reconocerlo porque tenemos que buscar una retórica más eficaz de la que ha habido hasta ahora. Eficaz incluso con respecto a convencer individuos que no conocemos. O sea, ese es el desafío que en realidad nos estamos encontrando. Vemos todas las características de la economía, vemos el reflejo de la irracionalidad económica de 60 y tantos años de concentración de poderes económicos, etcétera, de gobierno en el partido. Pero tenemos que buscar de alguna manera, y yo creo que es una preocupación que siempre he tenido, qué clase de lenguaje, qué clase de retórica, qué clase de discurso, qué narrativa puede convencer a los que vengan detrás a que hagan los cambios que tiene que haber en Cuba. O sea, nosotros ya en este momento están agotadas las posibilidades del lenguaje, de la recomendación económica, de política económica tradicional. En Cuba eso no funciona. Y hay que ayudar, yo puedo pensar, o sea, se me ocurre pensar que hay mucha gente que estarían definitivamente con los oídos, ojos y oídos bien abiertos para recibir nuevas instrucciones, nuevas recomendaciones, nuevas estrategias para mejorar la economía cubana. Más tarde o más temprano, algún cambio tiene que haber. La cuestión es por medio de qué retórica podemos empezar a utilizar y sobre todo específicamente, o sea, si uno de los problemas fundamentales de Cuba es la incomprensión de los agentes decisorios de Cuba, ¿cómo nosotros podemos educar a esa gente para tomar las medidas adecuadas? Porque ahora es interesante, y quiero terminar con esto, parte de la cultura establecida, y es una cultura establecida a la fuerza desde el año 59, y una cultura que, por cierto, cambia en cierta medida cuando muere Fidel Castro. Después de la muerte de Fidel Castro hay un cambio cultural, quizás no muy espectacular, pero definitivamente notable en cuanto a las preferencias de Fidel Castro en términos de cómo utilizar su tiempo, cómo utilizar sus poderes políticos y económicos. Definitivamente hay un cambio cuando Raúl Castro toma el poder y ahora se supone que ha habido una serie de cambios, pero muy insuficientes todavía. Pero es importante que en el diálogo, de alguna manera, aunque sea incluso sea de una manera diplomática y gentil, hay que señalar que hay un problema de conocimiento por parte de los agentes decisorios en Cuba. No saben lo que están haciendo, ni quieren saber, y aparentemente no tienen una gran inseguridad en cuanto a tomar decisiones. Con respecto a eso, por ejemplo, yo creo que hay un elemento cultural muy importante en Cuba. Hay una gran desconfianza por parte del gobierno y del partido de liberar un poco la economía de los agentes decisorios que están en la población, los consumidores, los productores, etcétera. Hay una desconfianza en cuanto a que si se le da algunos grados de libertad a esta gente, pueden utilizar esos grados de libertad con otros fines, no necesariamente simplemente económicos. O sea, desconfianza, estoy más o menos en términos del capital social, una de las dimensiones del capital social, que es la confianza interpersonal, y en este caso sería la confianza de los agentes decisorios en el gobierno sobre el resto de la población y el miedo que tienen de que utilicen grados de libertad con otros fines. Todo esto, yo creo que el desafío fundamental en que se encuentra la economía cubana en este momento es precisamente convencer a los agentes decisorios, o los actuales posiblemente sea inútil, o los que vienen, o los que están ya en sus posiciones, pues no sabemos quiénes son, para tomar decisiones adecuadas sobre la economía cubana. Quiero terminar con esto, tengo más desarrollo en el paper, ya lo verán cuando se distribuya. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much, Jorge. Our next presenter is Tamarys Bahamonde-Perez from the University of Delaware. Her paper is going to, which is titled, I think she'll be able to answer or respond to some of the questions that Jorge has. Her paper is entitled Cuba's Bureaucratic System and the Economic Crisis. So Tamarys is working on her PhD in Public Policy and Urban Planning at the University of Delaware. She holds a master's degree in local development from the University of Camagüey and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Havana. Tamarys, floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my, I hope you can see it, just let me know. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we could see it.
Yes.
Could you put fuller screen?
Yeah, I'm on it. It's taking time. Now it's fine. Can you see it?
It's fine. It's lovely.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you for inviting me here. I want to start by saying that this presentation and the paper accompanying it is just a small portion of my future dissertation work, which is going to be about crisis decision-making in Cuba and how the bureaucratic structure at the highest level of the process where the decisions are made actually in Cuba, how that is actually affecting the crisis management in the country, which probably, so I was listening to Jorge, and I was very glad that he was asking those questions, because those are some of the questions that I'm planning on answering, if I can, during my dissertation or while I'm working on my dissertation. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, I have no definitive answer now. I'm just starting this, and well, as a scientist, I don't want to just say what I feel or what I intuitively we can feel. I actually want to prove it theoretically and empirically. We have a lot of literature about bureaucratic government and bureaucratic structures from scientists that are coming from the capitalist system, like Weber and others, Melton, that have tried to explain how the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic structures are important for government administration, and the field of public administration have given us a lot of theoretical approaches that help us to understand how bureaucracies work. And I think that Jorge was mentioning something very important that is regarding the culture. Culturally, I mean, organizational culture is an entire field that tries to understand how these behaviors are affecting the reactions on how decisions are made. And I think I agree with him, and that we have to understand how the organizational culture is affecting decision-making in Cuba, particularly the crisis management, because if we understand that, then we're going to understand how and why some decisions are made despite the negative impact or undesired impacts that they might have in Cuban society or other Cuban society. So there are four important ideas or main themes or arguments that we have to review when we are going to talk about bureaucracy. We need to understand that according to those that study bureaucratic states, and here we are not talking about the bureaucratic studies, the classical bureaucratic studies. We are talking about Rosa Luxemburgo, we are talking about Ernest Mandel, we are talking also about other academics from former Soviet, socialist countries or Eastern Europe that try to understand how these huge, enormous bureaucratic states were affecting or work in order to explain how the decisions were made there. There is not enough empirical research in this field, but there is a huge amount of theoretical research. So that is something. Basically, they say that we have this bureaucracy respond to the social division of labor. They say that you have the intellectual work on one side, and then you have the manual work. According to these studies, or these scholars, they say that usually these bureaucratic structures in these countries tend to be led by intellectual people. We are not talking about intellectuals in the strict sense of the word. We are talking about individuals that hold academic degrees, for saying in a way. They are not exactly blue collar workers, or they are not coming from the base of the society. So there is also the question of if it is the bureaucracy a new social class in the socialist state. No one has empirically answer these questions. So we cannot tell for real whether they behave or they have a conscious as a class, if they identify themselves, if this is it is a self-identification as a social class separated from the rest of the people, which is important too, because that marks a different behavior. And there is also the question of the extent of the bureaucratic system. It is linked to the debate between decentralization and centralization. And Jorge was referring to that too, when he was saying that how vertically decisions are made, how rigid that decision-making process is in Cuba. And that has a lot to do with centralization versus decentralization. And here we have something interesting. Cuba tend to decentralize the decision-making process in the deepest moment of the crisis. I mean, it's like they wait for the crisis to reach rock bottom, to touch rock bottom, and then they decide to take some steps. I mean, it is not the kind of decentralization that we are used to see, for example, here in the United States. Obviously, we are not talking about that, but we are talking like small steps for decentralizing the economy, or at least some resources. While the economy starts recovering, and we saw this during the 90s, when the economy starts recovering a little bit, they tend to re-centralize, and that affects the economic performance. And also we have another element, and this is added by my research. I added the last element. While we have the domestic blockade is a category that I have created based on how Cubans refer to the domestic blockade. We said it in Spanish, el bloqueo interno, and it's a way to make a differentiation, since the government refers so much, and they tend to blame the external blockade or the embargo for every difficulty that the economy is facing in Cuba, which, by the way, it is important to say that yes, the blockade actually affects the Cuban economy performance. It actually exists, it actually represents a challenge, but it's not the only problem that the Cuban economy faces. So the Cubans, you all are familiar with the Cuban humor. I don't know if you know that we call it those difficulties that come from within our system or our structures, we call it a bloqueo interno. So I created this domestic blockade as a new way to see how the bureaucratic structure could be obstacling the economic performance and the crisis management. And it's different from what we know as administrative burden, which is not exactly focused on the highest level of the decision making. So what is the problem, or how can we identify the side effects of highly centralized and bureaucratized governments? Well, obviously the institutions, the bureaucratic institutions like the party, have permanent intervention in the economy, and Jorge already referred to that, so I'm not going to get into it so much. And that obviously affects the economic performance. And there is a lot of examples, and the Chinese corporative model is one of them. We have that the state owns the means of production. As Jorge was also saying, the Cuban government is the major employer, so, and concentrates the property, and most of the property. So, and controls even foreign investment, domestic private investment, whether you can or not access to create a cooperative. Obviously, that is also affecting. And these decisions are made through a very vertical process. The party's role as night watchers, and this is very important, asphyxiates creativity. I'm not going to get into that because we all are familiar with that, but it's very important characteristics also in the Cuban economy, and was said actually by Rosa Luxemburg in 1971. So it is really difficult for a bureaucratic structure to understand how society is working. There is a gap between how the Cuban society is working and how the government or the higher structure of the government is understanding that. That gap is reflected in the policy, in how policies are made and some kind of time that take to make the decisions. And when you take that time for making decisions while the economy is going through a recession or through a crisis, time is the most important resource for solving economic crises or economic problems. When they take the decision sometimes too late, or at least not in the moment that the decisions should be made in order to prevent a deeper crisis. As a result of that, usually the Cuban economy goes from a recession that could be prevented to a recession, and then it goes from a recession that doesn't have to be that deep to a recession that is extremely deep with food scarcity and everything we know that Cuba is facing now, and we don't know how it's going to face it in the current year. And there is a lot of literature that says that the bureaucracy is the principal reason for the demise of the Soviet socialism. So it could be the case in Cuba also that the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic structure plays a role in the demise of the Cuban socialism. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I'm just saying that if the Cuban government wants to save the socialism as a project, then they need to pay attention of how the bureaucratic structure is working in the country. So how are we going to, I am defining the domestic blockade as inherent from this bureaucratic structure. And it's the combined political will of multi-level bureaucrats that obstacle the proper design, development, or even implementation of policies at any level of the bureaucratic structure. And because they feel that their status quo and their power position is threatened by these policies or these changes in policy. So in order to preserve the status quo, they react to the introduction of changes that, you know, like they react at tackling this, the proper development of policies. There is a lot of, there is not a lot of literature, empirical research about public administration in Cuba. For starters, on public policy, there is no career of public administration. There is no career of public policy in Cuba, which means that these two fields are a little bit abandoned. So we studied economics, as I did, and somehow we have access to some of these theories, but actually it's not enough. And Navia, for example, created some kind of hierarchical order. I'm not exactly using this in my research, my dissertation, but for the purposes of this presentation, we are going to use these 3 levels, where we have basically the high level of bureaucrats in Cuba, leader of the state, the parties, army, international corporations, national and international institutions. The middle level bureaucrats, we have here enterprises, executives, municipalities and provinces, head of or presidents of local assemblies, for example. And then we have the grassroots bureaucrats, and these are the current officers, street level bureaucrats, basically. So how is the Cuban government organized? I'm going to go quickly over it because it's not, I mean, most of you are familiar with this structure. The constitution changed, and this is one of the most important changes is that the time frame for holding a position has changed, so they can only hold it for 2 mandates. And we introduced, I say we because I'm studying here, but I'm still Cuban, so I'm kind of divided. So we still have the prime minister. I mean, we introduced the figure of the prime minister. And then, well, you have the president of the National Assembly of the People's Power, and the Council of State, and the party, which is important to mention because the party is according to the Article 5 in the Cuban Constitution, the party is the institution or the organization that holds the power in Cuba. And that is very important because it means that it doesn't matter how democratic the process is, the party is going to make decisions or it's going to have a huge influence in the decision-making process, even though the party is a political organization, it's not supposed to hold such a huge power. I mean, not in my opinion. And also, it's important to say that the party has 800,000 members. We're talking about a country with 11 million, with a population of 11 million, led by an organization that only have 800,000 members. So the Cuban bureaucracy, a little bit of some important characteristics that influence the way that decisions are made in Cuba is, as I said, that it's a disproportional participation of blue collar or non-college, let's say that way, non-college workers in the decision-making process at the highest level of the leadership and administration. The age composition of the Politburo is still over 70 years old, which is extremely worrisome because the problem is that you don't have the proper replacement process. There is no leadership after this generation. There is no one inside that you can say, well, this is a person that could take this position, or this is a person that could lead the party in the future. And since the party is ultimately the organization that leads the country, that could represent a problem that is compromising the future leadership in Cuba and the decision making. And obviously, this is something that has been mentioned before, and it's the low participation of women in the Council of Ministers and the party's leadership. And I'm going to make a small anecdote. I was in the Uber one day, and the Uber driver is a US citizen. He asked me where I was from, and I said Cuba. He said, well, that's fine. I read you have a first lady now. You should be glad because you are a woman, so you should be glad that you have a first lady. And I was like, no, I'm going to be glad when we have a president that is a woman. And that's something that I don't see happening in the near future, because actually there is still some kind of gender gap in the Cuban government, which is, I don't see the moment that we could cover that. I'm going to use the example of GAESA for showing how this bureaucratic, extremely vertical bureaucratic structure and huge bureaucratic structure is also affecting the corporative and the enterprise administration. This is important because ultimately enterprises, I mean, our economy depends on these enterprises. So we need to understand how these enterprises are working in Cuba, what is the functioning of these enterprises in Cuba in order to see how this is affecting the crisis management and how we face the crisis. GAESA is one of the most important corporations in Cuba. And this, you can see on the left, you see the Cuban enterprise system. You have la Organización Superior de Dirección Empresarial, and they have a lot of enterprises in every OSDE. And then you have the UEBs, or Unidades Empresariales de Base, they are like the enterprise, basic unit of enterprise. As you can see, that's a vertical design that is a very, and in the case of GAESA, it belongs to the ministry, to the army, MINFAR. GAESA is directly subordinated to the MINFAR, which means that it's a military structure. And we know how military is different from civil life and how decisions are made in the military life, which means that basically most of the Cuban enterprise system works under military culture or organizational culture. It means there is little little to say about decisions, and the process is vertical. Do this, and there is nothing to argue about it. No feedback, it's just a chain of command. So when you have the guy, in the Cuban economy, the guy is part of the army, and you have that they hold most of, or an important proportion of the Cuban economy. I'm very grateful for Havana Consulting Group to put together all this data. It's very hard to find proper data in Cuba or about Cuba. So this is how the division of labor was in CEMEX, which is part of GAESA. CEMEX is the small portion of GAESA. It was absorbed by GAESA in the last decade, in 2008, 2009. And it hasn't changed that much, even though the data is from 2008. This structure hasn't actually evolved that much in those years. I was a consultant in Cuba, so I'm familiar with the organizational culture in Cuban enterprises. And I know that the one of the biggest problems that we have to face when we try to improve these enterprises is the culture, is the bureaucratic mindset that the leaders of these enterprises have. And this bureaucratic mindset comes from the top. It means that they are programmed for behaving like that. They don't make decisions by themselves, they consult. So if they cannot make decisions about the enterprise because they fear that they can lose their position, and I think that Jorge was referring to this more or less in other terms, it means that in the process where they request for some, we need to change that, and then it's a long chain of command to the top of the leadership of the organization, and then to the bottom where this director or deputy director is making decisions, and time passes, and it could be months. And this is why there is a gap between when you face a problem and when you can make actually a decision for solving the problem. In the meantime, the crisis is deepening. And there is a huge administrative structure. As you can see, in CEMEX, only CEMEX has had in 2008, 2667 units for management and administration activities. You can imagine how complex an organization has to be for having over 2,000 units only for management and administration, and only 1,700 units for production. It means that they have more units of management than units working, actually creating, producing, manufacturing. And that is one of the causes, that is probably one of the causes why we have so many problems with exportations, and we have to import a lot of basic products. That also affects how we perform in agriculture, obviously, and how we, even though this is not directly linked to agriculture, this is a general culture in Cuban enterprises, whether they belong to the MINFAR or not. This is more or less how they behave in general, how the organizations are. So when you have a lot of administrative and management units and just a few units dedicated to produce, well, we are economists, we know what is the result of that. So what is the problem or what are some of the recommendations that some experts are giving for facing this domestic blockade? Separating enterprises from the ministerial structures. Particularly, I would add that I could separate them from the ministries linked to the military. I couldn't have any enterprise, civil enterprise, connected or linked to military ministries. Eliminating any higher level of management that parasites the operation. This is the ASCE. Obviously, that mega structure should be eliminated. And I I mean, I advocate for smaller structures of enterprises that work with local governments instead of being subordinated to ministries, but that's a whole new area of research. And instead of using the mechanisms for resource allocation that we are using that are rigid, let's think about a copier, for example. We should start using financial planning, which is, I believe, a little bit more, or have proven being more effective, and could help to incentivize somehow the production and exportations capacity. So I still have lingering questions. Are the bureaucrats a new social class in Cuba? And I think that that's something I probably be answering in my dissertation. And I could say that yes, there are chances that the bureaucracy could be working as an obstacle to the crisis response and development in Cuba. But I also would say that we need to conduct more empirical research to prove that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to open up the floor to some questions, but I'm going to give myself just a chance to kind of put some graphs together to talk about, just as I'm going to leave myself the chance to be the first person to ask a question. And it's just going to be kind of rhetorical to some degree. I hope you could see this screen here. Several screens. First of all, this is a graph, and what I want to emphasize here, the last two presenters, what we're talking about is institutions, and we're looking at two different ways of society to organize or to have different types of institution. As you can see, this graph here is the real GDP for China, which is the blue line, and Cuba, the red line. As you could see, what the difference is in terms of institution, how quickly by 2008, China's GDP surpassed Cuba's real per capita GDP. Again, because of these differences in institutions. Okay, I mean, a stark graph of this is always looking at North and South Korea, which everyone's familiar with. Again, different institutions. Here, Chile's real GDP per capita, the blue line, and Cuba's. Okay, again, this is around beginning of 1970, very close, still close enough to the beginning of the revolution where they were both basically at the same level. Immediately you could see what the difference is in institutions in creating and improving individuals' wealth. Here's as everyone can see, Germany and Germany, East Germany and West Germany. You can see again the differentials, and immediately after the change of institution, the movement towards convergence. Okay, so I think that in terms of economic development in Cuba, and really the major question in terms of explaining economic development across the world is the question of institutions. And so the last two presenters, they're really the crux of the matter is how do we implement, how do we explain, how do we endogenize the creation of institutions that increase the wealth of a country versus other institutions which objective is the redistribution of income from one class to another, or is meeting other types of objectives. So that's all at this point, I just wanted to bring this up as a, as a point to discuss. All right, so I will open it up. I'll read some of the questions that have been asked. First question from Lorenzo was, is the source of the balance of payments data, particularly the negative other transfers information, does that come from the statistical office of the central bank or the central bank? I guess this is for Ernesto. Ernesto? Ernesto?
Yeah, you want me to respond now?
That question, yeah, please, if you don't mind.
Yep. The way I calculate the balance of payments transfers in my version of the balance of payments is as follows. I first take the data provided by ONE on what they call net transfers, net balance of payment, current account transfers. I then subtract from that estimates of remittances from mainly from North American based Cubans, and that is always a positive number. And then I subtract that from the ONE figure for transfers to get this mysterious negative, always negative form of transactions. Again, we don't know what that is. Now, ONE does not provide data for remittances from abroad, but we know they exist, and we have a reasonably good estimate for these transactions. So I assume that those numbers for remittances exist and that they are part of ONE's net transfers. Therefore, there must be a residual. This residual is a large and consistent negative number. And again, it must conceal something. And what is concealed there is a large element of imports by someone from somewhere.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Luis from Sylvia. If you were to give advice to the Cuban government, Díaz-Canel, regarding monetary issues, wages, etc., what would you tell them?
Well, they are, I think we have to understand what's going on. There is a, in terms of the monetary issue, in terms of monetary policy, so there is the first stage, which is taking place now, is simply to provide sufficient liquidity to the system, initial liquidity to keep working at a much higher dollar price. So that's the first stage. Now, the second stage, which is what will be important to see the inflation dynamics. In other words, is inflation going to pick up? And this depends on whether or not they are successful in curtailing subsidies to state enterprises. Now, this is a tough question because in order to curtail subsidies, the state companies must shrink or disappear, the ones that are very inefficient. So they'll have to fire. I mean, the numbers that Tamarys was showing about the CEMEX bureaucracy is essentially common. In other words, a good chunk of the of state employees are essentially unproductive, and they are subsidized. They are maintained there to essentially obscure what would be open unemployment. So I mean, they must tackle that if they want to tackle inflation dynamics. The way it looks now, it isn't happening. And the numbers show it. In other words, the budget numbers show that these companies will remain employing all these unproductive people, which are so. The second thing is the shock to the banking system and to firms. You know, they are facing a liquidity crunch, and that needs to be essentially remedied. And the way they are doing it is by essentially providing banks. Central bank is providing banks with liquidity so that they can then come to the rescue of the firms as well. So it's both the state budget and the central bank. Ultimately, it all goes back to the central bank. So, I mean, these things are very difficult things to do in the short term, but they unfortunately imply that inflation is going to be a big problem. And I mean, the price have to be controlled, and the price indices, when they come out, the last price indices they produced didn't include consumer prices. They include the deflators for the product, for GDP. But essentially, the monetary situation will ultimately stabilize if they take the tough measures needed to reduce subsidies more than they have shown. Now, what this requires, as the other element of it, is that the private sector is enabled to absorb the employment from the state sector. And that isn't happening because the reforms are very, very weak. They are now opening restaurants. Restaurants are going to be privatized, but that's a very small part of the economy. The foreign investment measures are also not going to attract much foreign investment. So essentially, there has to be far more opening to the private sector. And I mean, there economists in Cuba have provided many recommendations that are quite sensible and quite well designed as to how to stimulate small and medium-sized enterprises, how to make state companies more competitive and so forth. But essentially, they are in a very tough position. And unfortunately, the medicine is going to have to be difficult, and they do not have much external help in doing this, both financially and in terms of advice. As Jorge Sanguinetty was mentioning, that they need more advice in terms of policy design. So in any case, I don't have any magic answers. The answers are very tough.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm going to tie to this, and Neto, I'm going to ask you the question. Somebody asked, how would the devaluation been implemented had Cuba belonged to the IMF?
I think not very different, except the IMF would have insisted, I believe, at least the IMF that I know would have insisted on the rapid and complete elimination of state subsidies. The notable thing in this discussion is that it assumes that the Soviet Union does not exist or did not exist, and that what happened to communist countries at the end of the last century did not happen. But it did happen. All these countries have to devalue. All these countries, with the possible exception of Turkmenistan, had to eliminate their subsidies. And I assure you, because I was there, that nobody died. Okay? So what we have now in Cuba from a lot of spectators is a fear of change. Fear of change that, of course, is shared by the government. But again, these things happen in Eastern Europe. They happen in the former Soviet Union, and nobody died. Inflation, in as much as it happened, was the result of continued inflationary financing by the central bank. In countries where that did not occur, because the central bank did not want to fuel inflation, there was a once and for all increase in prices, and that was it. And then you had price stability. That's what happened in Estonia. That's what happened in Latvia, and that's what happened in Lithuania. So I think the fears of all this are exaggerated. The elimination of subsidies is going to be hard. It's going to be very hard, but it will be temporary. And it's hard because that's the price you have to pay for decades of communism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jose Gabilondo has a question for Tamarys. When Cuban officials discuss the state, sometimes they distinguish between el sector presupuestado and el sector empresarial. How do you draw the line between these two sectors?
Well, I'm not sure I exactly understand what is the meaning of drawing the line. So I'm gonna ask him to, if when I answer what I understood, if he has any more questions, he can let me know if I answer it or not, what he was actually asking. Well, actually, what we know as a sector presupuestado in Cuba would be known in part of what we know in Cuba as sector presupuestado would be known in other countries like the United States as non-for-profit. Some of them are actually non-for-profit organizations. Let's talk about schools, universities, hospitals. Some of them are mostly presupuestados, which means that el sector presupuestado is fed by el sector empresarial. In that sense, what you produce in el sector empresarial is supposed to be sufficient for the self-reproduction of this sector, the empresarial, and also it should be sufficient for feeding el sector presupuestado and the public expenses of the government. I don't know if that's exactly what he's asking. So.
Okay, it's all right. Caroline McCullough also has a question for you. So she mentions, and her question is, let me get to it.
I have it. I have the question here. I can read it if.
You have it? Okay. Would you please address it?
Yeah, sure. Should I read it, or it's fine if I just jump to the answer?
Let me tell them everyone what it is, right? Just in case. Yeah,
Okay.
she wants to know how the different bureaucratic models between the U.S. and Cuba affect each government's ability to understand and communicate with each other.
Well, this is because her question has two parts. For the first part, I think that when we want to understand the government's ability for understanding each other, and we're talking about Cuba, United States, it goes beyond the bureaucratic structure and bureaucratic institutions, obviously. This is a long history of somehow complex relationships between the two countries. But obviously, the way that the United States understands the organizational culture, democracy, participation is in a different way that how Cuba sees participation, democracy, and organizational culture. And obviously, in that sense, the two governments are speaking different languages. I'm not talking about English or Spanish. They are talking about, I'm talking about different languages in policy and public administration sense. The way the Cuban government understands how decisions are made has nothing to do with the way that the United States understands how decisions are made. For starters, the United States have a very decentralized government where states hold a lot of power and discretional power for making decisions by their own, and Cuba does not have that. And while the United States somehow advocates for the pluralism and participation and combines multiple stakeholders in the decision making, the Cuban experience is more centralized, vertical, and not multiple stakeholders participate in the decision making. And I'm going to make a parenthesis here. When in that sense, the Cuban case is providing me a unique case for understanding how governments make decisions, without intervention, external intervention. By external intervention, I mean other stakeholders. Since the Cuban government makes decisions at the highest level of the bureaucratic structure, basically by themselves, without multiple institutions, organizations, and enterprises participating in that decision-making process, is a pure government response to crisis, which is very interesting for my research purposes, but obviously is somehow affecting not only how they manage the crisis, but also how they manage their international relations, particularly with the United States, because the culture, the organizational culture in Cuba is affecting how they see the relations with the United States by the history of antagonism of the countries, logically. And this is filtering in society. So when someone new takes position, a bureaucratic position, is already permeated by that culture or interpretation of about how the relations with the United States should be. And she has a second. She's also asking me the lack of. She said also you mentioned the lack of women in leadership. Building on that, how do you think the underrepresentation of Afro-Cubans in higher leadership affects the decision making? That's a very interesting question, because we have a problem with the problem starts with statistics. Since Cuba is inheriting all this, has adopted the republicanism ideas from France. From the French Revolution, we do not register in our statistics we do not collect statistics or gather statistics by race or skin color, as we call it in Cuba, which means that we don't know what is the participation of African Cuban or African descendants in Cuba in the economy, or how they are participating in the economy, if they are university graduate, if they are more concentrated in poor areas or marginal areas in Cuba, or if they still are mostly concentrated in the low income proportion of society. That is also reflected in how they participate in the country's leadership, because obviously if they are still facing problems for participating in or getting academic degrees, for example, or they are marginalized still or living in poor regions or low income sectors of the society, then obviously they are facing more obstacles for participating in the bureaucratic structures, because as I said, most of these bureaucrats in Cuba are university graduates. And definitively, obviously, that is affecting how the government policies, how can I say this? How the policies take into account the differences in Cuban society at the time of designing, implementing, and evaluating policies. If you don't look for what are the differences in equity in the country, if you do not explore the social imbalances or gaps, gender gaps, racial gaps, social gaps, if you do not go into that, you will not find out and you will not solve them. So a bigger participation of women and African descendants in the decision-making process in Cuba could, in my opinion, could lead to a better decision-making process and a more inclusive society.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna, two more questions related. So Manuel Villalon wants to know, is the negative balance concealing a large number of imports, or is it concealing a large sum being sent abroad by the military officials? So I'll allow, even Jorge knows about this, to, respond to that question. And Lorenzo Perez also wants to know what could be done to increase the price elasticity of exports and import substitution activity, particularly in the food sector. So who wants to address the first one regarding Neto, the negative, the large number of imports? Or Jorge?
The large level of imports and the low level of exports is due in large measure to the exchange rate system. It's a system that discriminates against exports and favors import substitution. Now, what's going to solve that remains to be seen, but I think the exchange rate reform that is going on probably will make a big contribution to increase exports and to reduce imports. That may take some time, but I don't think it's correct to say that Cuba only exports rum and tobacco and that is not enough. I think there's enormous room for Cuba to increase its share of the world market in beverages, in tobacco, and in coffee. But in addition to that, I don't see why in the future Cuban exports should be limited to that. If the state monopoly on trade is eliminated, if workers and managers are allowed to produce freely, and here I fully agree with Luis that an important decision of the government has to be to open up the economy to the public, to the private sector, much more than it has been so far. If that happens, there is no reason why Cuba cannot generate new and different forms of exports.
Okay. In terms of Luis, you want to address, which is already he's addressed it regarding the, I think that's right, hits on the increasing the price elasticity of exports,
Yes,
privatizing much more so.
I mean, this is it's going to be difficult to do this in the even in the medium term because there's little complementary supplies of the supply chains are not there in terms of imported inputs and domestic inputs to expand, and also capital. Nickel, for instance, Cuba, by the way, is getting a bit of a help in the second half of 2020 from nickel prices are at an all-time high, and this is Cuba's main good export. But you know, in order to expand that, it needs substantial capital investments, and most of the investment in the nickel field, for example, has been essentially a reinvestment of profits, not really new capital flows from abroad. There is a joint venture that takes care of most of nickel production with a Canadian company. But I think that it will take, as Ernesto says, it will take time to increase the elasticity of for instance, many goods exports. In terms of imports, I mean, the numbers show that the budget constraint is there, that essentially they've dropped 50% in 2 years. So as we can tell, it probably dropped more in the last 3 quarters of last year. We don't have the data, but here we have not a question of the price mechanism, but simply the country faces a very tough budget constraint. It faces a problem with foreign exchange receipts. A large part of that is Venezuela not paying for what Cuba is billing Venezuela, and Venezuela is not paying except in oil. By the way, a surprising number that just came out last week is that Venezuela has been shipping Cuba about 99,000 barrels per day in 2019, which is a lot higher than experts had estimated. So that is a kind of payment that Venezuela is making, but it is uncertain that some of that may be chipped out back to other third countries, and we don't understand the payment mechanisms. But essentially, it is possible, as Ernesto says, if one opens the private sector, begins making foreign investment more attractive. And it's not a question of the legislation. The legislation is actually, it's all right. It's the question of the operating environment in Cuba that is so difficult. And of course, there is a US constraint that the US market is closed. And that certainly is an important factor, and also US legislation. But right now, the effect of the opening of foreign investment, the change of regulations and laws in the last 3 years has not really yielded too much in terms of new investment, and that would be needed to increase the elasticity of exports and an import substitution also as well. Right now, the lack of capital is very important, and I should say, with in regard to Carlos's graphs, that big difference between Cuba and places like China and Vietnam is that the savings rate in Cuba is something in the order of about 10-12%, and in China is 42%. So if you have those two, you're going to have a very important growth dynamics that Cuba also faces, not only the institutional constraint, but the fact that it has a shortage of savings, both domestic and foreign.
Okay, I'm going to have one, Maritza Cristina Garcia asked, by leaving the exchange rate at $1 to 24 pesos, while increasing salaries and prices at similar rates, the government is effectively devaluing the purchasing power of remittances, which alienates remittance senders and affects the subsectors of the private sector that trades in US dollars. For example, the bars and the eateries. Private businesses, and here's basically the statement, it's a statement, private business will not be able to keep up with these salaries at this exchange rate. What is the logic of it?
Well, I mean, it's not quite that, because remittances are in dollars, and they are transacted to a significant extent in the parallel market, which is essentially something between 30 and 45, not 24. So whoever has access to dollars and those transact in the parallel market is actually doing okay. Now, some of the remittances are not transacted in the parallel market. They go through the state stores, which are very expensive. So that is a question. But of course, there is a redistribution impact of remittances. It's no question about that. And whoever has access to it is better off than who doesn't have access to it.
Okay, Tom has a very similar question, and the panel can open it up. Are these reforms good for the Cuba's private sector? Okay, since obviously the government employees, he says, will receive salary increases to compensate for inflation. What does it do about the private sector workers?
First of all, you have to radically modify the existing system in Cuba, whereby the role of the private sector is limited by an exclusive list. Only those bars, restaurants, and other less brilliant forms of employment, only those are tolerated by the government. Now, what has to happen now is that as soon as possible, and this is not difficult to do, the private sector is allowed to operate in other sectors, clinics, hospitals, universities, schools, etc. That's fairly easy to do. and would provide employment because the public sector still, in spite of the positive developments in the recent decade, still has to shed off excess employment that has been there because of the state subsidies. And so room has to be made for the private sector. And I think it's fairly easy to do. It's difficult politically, and it's difficult because what Jorge Sanguinetty calls the value system, because the value system is opposed to giving freedom to the private sector to act.
Can I jump in here too?
Sure, sure.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Well, there is also, I mean, I agree with what Professor Ernesto was saying. Obviously, that's one of the major problems we are facing. And also there are other questions related specifically to the policies that have been designed. And it is, for example, that with the prices increase, they are going to see their cost or the expenses, the operational expenses rising, which means that they are going to have to make hard decisions, because when we talk about private enterprise or private domestic enterprise in Cuba, we have to consider that the size, they are small enterprise. They just few of them could be classified as medium enterprise. And in that, and mostly they are dedicated to restoration activities and hostels, hoteles, but small hoteles or just 1, 2, 3 bedrooms that people rent, which means that these prices increases are going to have a major effect in some of these private small Cuban enterprises, which means that indirectly it could also affect the employment that we were talking about, because some of them probably will, first of all, they're going to have to increase probably prices for staying in business, and that is going to affect ultimately the clientele and how they participate in the market. And then they're going to have to make decisions about whether keeping the whatever employees they have or let them go. And it's going to discourage somehow the opening of new or the introduction of new participants in this private sector. So yes, it probably will affect a lot.
That's a good reason to have a decent unemployment compensation system in Cuba.
Well, let me just chime in here, though. Normally, we would have a system a labor market that's competitive. And if the private sector can't match the state sector's salaries, we would have a flow from the private sector to the public sector. Unfortunately, in the case of Cuba, I don't think anyone's going to be flowing from the private sector to the public sector as a result of the increases in wages. So it's not clear cut.
The private sector, the public sector could probably shrink also, because with the devaluation, the monetary devaluation, those enterprises that the panelists were talking about that were working with 1.1 exchange rate and now are going to be working with 1.24, some of them are going to run out of business. They're going to be inefficient now, and they either will close or they're going to be, fusion with other enterprises, and as a result of that, some people are going to lose their jobs too in the public sector. So here, Carlos, we are facing a very uncertain future scenario, unfortunately.
Okay, well, if any other comments from the presenters, I have addressed at least all the questions that have been sent to me. Otherwise, we will end this session and look forward to the next sessions to come.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much for agreeing.
All right, thank you very much. It was a great session, and I look forward to our upcoming sessions later this afternoon, tomorrow, and the next day. Again, thank you for just an extraordinary set of presentations. and an even more extraordinary conversation afterwards.
Yeah, if I could just say something, I talked at the beginning in my introduction that this conference was to really talk about, hopefully, suggestions for the Cuban government of how to move forward. Even I think you did an absolutely excellent job, everybody. You got it right to the heart of what we were trying to do. Thank you so much.
All right.